Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. Returning this week is my comrade and frequent guest, Seth Sturm, formerly of the Democratic Party of West Virginia and still kind of a pain in their ass. How are you doing today, Seth?
I'm doing good. I got to point this out because I've been attacked this week. I'm still a Democrat. I'm still registered as a Democrat. I am still one of them. And so I can speak to what they're doing, not as somebody criticizing from the outside, but as somebody who is still registered a Democrat. A lot of people were saying, oh, he's an independent now. Why is he even speaking on this issue? And, I'm not. So I don't want anybody to take that and run with it because I know how they are.
I know how people are too. I am going to start by trashing the Republicans today.
That's great. Listen, that's another thing they always say. I want to bash Democrats. I like to bash Republicans as well. So let's do that.
Well, Johnny Ernst, whom everybody loved as a governor and everyone loves in the Senate, made some interesting comments at a town hall. She was asked questions about Medicaid and whether people were and what she thought about people dying because of cuts to Medicaid. And she said rather glibly, as if it were no big deal, well, everybody dies. Like the fact that you're cutting people off their health care and making them die sooner doesn't matter because everybody dies. So that was a bad look in the first place. And then she did a quote unquote apology where she ends up saying, and if you really are interested in eternal life, then you should learn about my Savior, Jesus Christ, as if, Christianity is better than healthcare. Or more accurately, I guess the way she would put it is, if you're going to go to heaven, who cares if you die?
Well, and I went to a Christian school for a very long time, and I'm pretty sure the Bible talks about not hurting yourself, not bringing about your own demise before it's time. You're supposed to do everything you can to protect the temple. And so here's somebody who's using that scripture to say, hey, you shouldn't be worried about dying. You're going to go to heaven anyway. But there's no justification for doing that harm to what is God's property in their eyes. I mean, I'm not super religious, but that is the logic within their own book that they're citing for a reason to deny people health care. And it's just not logically consistent. And I don't understand.
Well, if you're going to demand logical consistency with their own scriptures from white Christians, then I have some unfortunate news for you.
Listen, don't ruin everything for me, Chris, but it's surprising to me that their own book makes it very clear what their position should be, and they'll twist that into something that is
the thing that always throws me a loop is that from somehow they got to, it is very hard for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven, to prosperity gospel.
Well, it's how you make that money. And if God gives you that money, that's fine. It's those evil rich people.
But that's the whole problem with Calvinism, is that we are supposed to believe that God gives all the rich people that money because God has everything planned out and it is all predestined.
There's so many interpretations of that scripture.
I know
iterations. It's wild to me because I went to a Christian school that was Baptist, and we were explicitly told that Calvinists were bad news. You know what I mean?
Well, that's funny because Baptists are Calvinists. So,
well, I don't know how all of that internally works. I'm just telling you what Pastor Stevenson told me at my spiritual probation, or I forget what they called it, but I had a meeting with him about my attitude in school. So we discussed that because he found out that I went to a Presbyterian church,
Oh my
And
gosh.
that was disturbing to him. And then he got into Calvin and his beliefs in predeterminism and how that goes against free will that God has given us. That was a whole thing, man.
And yet, yeah, that's so weird. Well, there are free will Baptists, which is a whole weird thing when you consider it. But whatever.
I
I don't want to talk
I'm
too
saying.
much about Christianity on a Sunday. I kind of do this show to get away from that.
But that's the funny thing is that I think both of us were pretty well within a lot of this in our youth, especially. I was I'm not religious, like I said. I'm not against religion in any way. I myself don't really practice too much, but it is what it is. And I think that when you look at these things, there are just some inconsistencies that everybody needs to address within their own beliefs and really take a hard look at what they think.
Well, I'm fascinated by the history of the racial wars in Europe before whiteness.
That's it is
and religion is centrally fundamental to those pre-whiteness religious wars in Europe.
Well, yeah, I mean, before there were real states and nation states, everything was run by the church and some sort of
well, that's the thing, is that there was this sort of claim to universal empire by the Pope that was also sort of taken seriously to some degree. To what degree was based on their own political benefit, it's true, but all the kings paid at least some sort of lip service to the idea that the Pope really was in charge in the end, until Protestantism. And the sort of deal with the devil that the Protestants made in order to get support against the Catholic Church was the idea that, well, the king, or the ruler, if not always the king, but the responsible ruler should be the one to have final say about religion in his domain, and not the Pope or any established church.
As somebody who's biracial Navajo, it's so funny to me how much of world history, how much that has happened to my people, comes from those beliefs and the way that those systems were originally structured. I mean, people really got to think about how long have humans been on Earth versus how long we've been building these systems. It's a very, very short period of time here. And I think we're going to have to reassess at some point as humans, if we want to survive, what the role of all of this is, what religion, the state, what is government, and can we modernize everything to make it less brutal and less reflective of those times from whence everything came.
Not if the Republican health care plan is everybody needs to be confident and assured that they're going to heaven, so they don't have to worry about whether they die on earth or not.
Well, you got a point there. I tell you what, that's a problem for us at this point, because that is against their own scriptures by my reading anyway. So,
well, I mean, Jesus specifically talks about healing and nursing the sick as a good thing, and actively goes out of his way to heal sick and disabled people. I mean, I feel like Jesus would have been more pro healthcare than his followers.
I feel like, and I don't understand the wanting to deny people health care. That, to me, just even if it wasn't explicitly mentioned in the Bible, would seem to be something that we could agree is a good thing. We have modern healthcare systems that can really benefit people. And that's not okay. So that's not something they had back then, right? When they were writing.
They didn't have penicillin or vaccines or a lot of other things that would have greatly improved the time. I mean, just imagine only working 15 hours a week, but also not dying from 39 because you stubbed your toe on a rusty nail.
Exactly. And so nobody could envision that at that time. And I understand the scriptures were ordained by God. and that they're universally true, applicable in any time period. That's fair, which means that take and extrapolate from what he said at that time for that audience into modern healthcare systems. The Christian thing to do is to make sure people don't die early and get sent to heaven. Okay. I mean, that's not even that far-fetched. So I mean, that's the first thing we've got to start doing, is calling people on this obvious nonsense. Even if you think that she's being honest, or that she believes these things, and that it is the Christian thing to just want to go to heaven, she's wrong. She's wrong, you know?
I mean, you notice she's got good health care. She doesn't appear to be in any hurry to go to heaven herself.
Well, she's more important. She has a mission out here. Everyone else, they got, you know. That is honestly the takeaway, too, is that there is this perceived, I'm more important than you.
Well,
I have a duty. You are just.
No. Well, that's fundamental to all of this. The whole attitude among our senior electeds of both parties, and this is where we can start segueing into trashing the Democrats, as David Hogg recently found out at the national level, is you know, you respect your party elders, and you do what they say, and you let them have their leadership positions until either they actually lose to someone or die. Republicans are a little better at replacing people in primaries than Democrats, but that's just because they actually give their voters a little bit more of a say in the primary process than Democrats do. That's one of the worst kept, one of the scariest and ugliest secrets in American politics, that as horrible as everything happening in the Republican Party is, we know the majority of Republicans want that, because the way their party is set up, the people who the majority of Republicans vote for gets the nomination in their way, whereas Democrats have all these systems in place to prevent democracy from breaking out.
Well, you know, I was on the news this week on out of Harrisonburg, Virginia. Some number, you know, some call sign. It doesn't matter. But the point is that
Harrisonburg is a college town. That's where James Madison University is, and Eastern Mennonite University, to name drop the Anabaptists.
Oh yes, shout out the Anabaptists. I agree. So one of the things that they took from the half-hour long interview I did with the guy was whenever I said that I want to see the Democratic Party be more democratic. And, you know, you mentioned David Hogg, and this has been a pattern that I've been calling out in West Virginia. And I've been saying that this has been the way that it's done at the DNC, that there are DNC officials kind of putting their noses into West Virginia business behind the scenes. And the actions we're seeing from the state party are mirrored in the actions the DNC is taking in other places. And so this story that I'm telling about West Virginia is about the Democratic Party as a whole.
Yep.
And so this week we've seen, okay, so a little bit of contextualizing here to rehash it for everybody. In 2021, I was elected the WVDP caucus, Indigenous Caucus, West Virginia Democratic Party Indigenous Caucus chair. Immediately, there are problems. We're not allowed to join the committees that are writing the affirmative action plan. We're not allowed to join anything. We're being completely shut out. And so it was just a bad process. And we immediately realized there's more going on behind the scenes. This affirmative action committee doesn't seem to be about promoting, minority interests. And long story short, that we ended up dissolving the caucus, battling the party, taking it to the DNC, rejected all of that.
And to summarize, the Affirmative Action Committee of the West Virginia Democratic Party was essentially a vehicle to get white people into important positions in the state party.
Right. So at that time, Joe Manchin's machine was still very active. The party chair was somebody that is very close to Joe and his family. And there was a lot going on about, animosity towards Joe Manchin. There was this group of people, the reformers, who kept trying to get more and more positions on the executive committee. This is important because this original goal that one of the first emails I sent out was, what's going on here? And why are we making demands of the party that have nothing to do with affirmative action? Why are we trying to gain seats on the Board of Appeals out of nowhere? Well, one of the people that had formed the affirmative action committee had appeals that were going to the Board of Appeals. I mean, it seemed like there was some weaponizing of this committee for personal agendas, and that's what I called out. And so so they wanted these positions on the executive committee, right? And so we got these at-large seats, and I said, hey, maybe we should try to divvy these at-large seats up to the caucuses. We would need one more. I talked to the party chair. I said, what if we could get one more at-large position and give them to each of the caucus members? Because at this point, they had already elected their at-large members from the AAC, and most of them were white. It's just how it was. And so I was trying to make that rules change. And, I'm trying to push for these actually more diverse policies, and things just spiraled out of control. But the core issue was, I thought they were using us to try to get in with the party, trying to make power within the party.
Yes.
Those people ended up taking over in 2022. Linda Biafor stepped down as party chair. Joe Manchin was out within the party, which, by the way, was something that I had suggested was coming in 2021 because of how things were playing out. Everything was just not kosher. None of it seemed to be above board. And so when these people took over, there was a lot of bad blood. But again, this was all about that power within the party. And so what's happened now is just a continuation of these same patterns of exclusion, of weaponizing the rules. And we finally have reached a place where the party went beyond their own realm of influence, right? When you can write the rules and interpret the rules, you get away with everything. You can do whatever you want. There's no accountability. There's no repercussion. They have taken their legal showmanship, let's say, their ability to twist these interpretations around to suit their needs. And I think they've crossed a line and actually gone against West Virginia state law and legal precedent here. So what they've done is this is the story. I'm going to try to be as clear as I can. In last year, they implemented an attendance policy that if you missed 3 meetings or in a row or 5 overall, you would be immediately removed from the executive committee. And you could appeal that if you wanted to. So that's the only violation that will get you immediately removed. There is nothing else that you could do to be immediately removed from that committee. That's just not Robert's Rules of Order has
being a member and not attending. That's bad.
Right. So what ended up happening now is they've removed 17 members overall for this policy, 14 of whom were elected at the polls by people in their district. This is something similar to that happened in 2019 with the Republican Party here, where they removed members from their executive committee. And the courts, that ended up going to court, and the judge ruled, Judge Tabbitt, I can't remember her, Judge Joanna Tabbitt out of Kanawha County. She ruled that state party bylaws cannot supersede state law, and that due process was denied to these members. Then she defined what due process was, and she used Robert's Rules of Orders, 5 steps, which includes an investigation, votes, all of that, before somebody could be removed. And it also said that they couldn't be removed for arbitrary reasons. It had to be something that would be defined in the state constitution as a removable offense. So malfeasance or whatever, but not arbitrary rules that are made. So the party
because when you're talking about an elected party representative, you're talking about an elected state official, even in a sort of weird adjunct capacity.
Right. So what's happened now, 14 members have been removed, and now 14 districts, their representation on the executive committee is about to be decided by the committee. a statewide
Yeah.
of internal.
And these are people who had voted for their committee representatives.
Exactly.
Who are now seeing their committee representatives thrown out for missed meetings, and seeing new representatives appointed for them as when they had voted for the representatives who are being removed.
Exactly. And so now we're in this position. Here's where it gets this is the part that I really like, because I've been calling out the Democrats for this showmanship, and I call it they think they're Perry Mason. I don't want to be, it's just it's an analysis. I'm not calling anyone names here. I'm just saying it's always like this big reveal in the courtroom, right? When they've decided something, they always make a big deal of it. We found precedent here back in 2016 in this delegate selection plan. We allowed this obscure ruling or whatever, and it's always used to take away somebody's voice or somebody's representation. They read this decision from Tabbitt. There are other ones as well. Apparently, there are people who are really digging into this. But they used language from this ruling in their removal letters and in their appeals forms that seems to be like anticipating these challenges, and they're attempting to redefine these terms based upon their own interpretations
and
in these internal
they're trying to adhere to the previous ruling as closely as they can in attempts to make themselves judgment proof.
And and these things aren't extremely well written. In the removal letter, for example, it says that you've been removed for good cause reasons or something like that. The way it's forced in there, this is a good cause, which is something that was ruled in the Tabbitt decision. You can't be removed for arbitrary. It must be for good cause. Then they have this form where they're talking about you can file 3 options. 2 of them are admitting guilt, and one of them says, I am appealing this decision and applying my due process rights. So there's this idea that maybe if they click this form, they're admitting this is their due process, and we can use this in court to say, no, they said this is their due process. So I think we're in this position, though, where enough people are aware of that maybe we're going to see some legal filings in the actual court soon, and the Democratic Party is going to have to finally face accountability from somebody besides themselves. And so for me personally, I see this as the culmination of everything I've been warning about coming to fruition. And I hope that we're going to see a situation where the courts say you can't do that. And maybe that will open eyes for all of these past injustices that we've been talking about, and seeing them through that same lens, seeing them through this power consolidation and manipulation of the party to serve some other interest, right? And again, you could say what you want about the Democratic Party, but this is a prime example of the corruption within, or the rot within, that needs to be called out and at least try to make people accountable. I can't say that it's going to turn things around and things are going to be great, but I can say that there are people out there who saw this coming. We tried to talk about it. And I mean, the only response I ever got was, Seth's a horrible person who's making things up. I've not been involved with the party directly for over a year, since my last second appeals hearing or whatever. I've stepped back. I said, you know what? They're going to do this to themselves, and they did. Now we're in a situation where they didn't do anything to me. I'm not directly impacted, but I'm able to take this situation and say, look, guys, this is directly related to the things I called out. This is them continuing that pattern of suppression and marginalization of people. And we can finally get some receipts to go along with our claims of discrimination now. So, what's interesting too, I went on the news, I got this out there. It was widely seen. A lot of people are talking about it. The party's not responded at all. It's been days. This happened early in the week. Their silence is telling me they know they're not in a great position legally. They don't want to get out and say something that they will then regret later. They're preparing for this legal challenge. And I wish more people would take this on. I've sent out a press release to 250 people in West Virginia. I sent out a press release to 3,500 people across the nation. I just want people to be aware of what's going on, right? So I've done my part. I'm doing my part. I'll continue to be there. And listen, this is the other thing. Let me put this out there for any Democrats watching, because I'm sure a lot of them will. If you have been impacted by the Democratic Party, get in touch with me. I am more than willing to stand up and take the heat. I've done it. I've been tore up, humiliated, publicly disparaged. I'm still here. I'm still saying the same things. It's been a consistent thing for me. And, you know, I'm willing to take that heat. So come to me. Let's work together to get your story out there without you being targeted by these people who are actively trying to suppress by means of intimidation. They see what's happened to people like me, or to the former president of the Young Democrats who was accused of criminal activity by the party. They don't want that to happen to them, and I don't want that to happen to them either. But getting your story out there and allowing accountability to take place, allowing these people to be, I don't want to say punished, right? But for us to move past what's happened and to get to a place where they're not able to at least weaponize this thing. That's the goal for me. And again, I'm not saying it's going to fix the Democratic Party. Everybody's got their criticisms of it, and they're largely right. This organization is top down in trouble and very, very influenced. I don't know how else to say it. Look at David Hogg. You mentioned
corporate capture.
Yeah,
that's absolutely the best way to put it. Corporate capture.
That's
the Democratic Party is a wholly owned corporate subsidiary.
And David Hogg has seen this firsthand now. You had somebody, he had energy. People liked him.
He wasn't even saying we need to primary all the conservative Democrats or anything like that. He's saying we need to get rid of a few of these people who kind of seem like they're pro-Trump sometimes.
Right. And that is something that they just don't allow for. And it's not, I don't even think it's necessarily what he said there. It's the implication that he's not going to be able to be.
He was essentially, what's hilarious to me is that he was essentially talking about people like Henry Cuellar and a few people in California and New York who are essentially Republicans despite being elected as Democrats, and who continually vote with Republicans in situations where no Democrat should ever be voting with Republicans if we really believe the Democratic Party's bullshit. And the response to this is, we need Henry Cuellar more than we need you, kid.
Well, and again, I believe wholeheartedly that
they were acting without him even naming anybody. They were acting like he had attacked James Clyburn, and apparently attacking James Clyburn is touching the third rail in the Democratic Party right now.
Well, and I think that's clear that something more is going on behind the scenes, right? Like, there should be no reason why saying that people who are essentially Republicans shouldn't necessarily be representing their party would be controversial, except for what that represents to them. Like, you've seen this,
yes,
and we've talked about this before. It's a lot of this is just power politics. They saw an opportunity here to say, this is why he's sowing seeds of discontent within the party, and we're going to do something about it. We're not going to stand for that. And notice, the place where his credentials are challenged is the same place where I'm trying to get my challenges heard, the Rules and Bylaws Committee. And so when powerful people go to this committee, it's a rubber stamp.
Yeah.
And when somebody like me comes along, we have no jurisdiction there. We couldn't do anything if we wanted to. Oh no. But they've done the same thing that I'm asking them to do in Alabama, right? It's just this another layer of legitimacy that they have. I say it like this. In colonial times, natives versus settlers, right?
Yeah.
The main difference, in my view, is that the settlers had the state, whichever time period, there was some authority backing them. and native peoples were left on their own and not allowed.
Well,
any defense was a violation, was an attack, and they could be then put down with malice, you know. And it's the same thing here. There's the state mechanism behind them.
The U.S., like Israel, is a settler construct that is designed to destroy and replace indigenous people. When you see white people get all up in their feelings about white people being replaced, it's because they know that's what they've done in other places in the world. And they know that they're still trying to replace Palestinians with European descendants. They're still trying to replace people in various countries in South America with whiter people. Donald Trump, oh my gosh, it's Donald Trump was deliberately making hay out of white wing tropes about South African genocide and resettling South African refugees in U.S. red states.
I mean, honestly, when you look at it, just like my story foretold what was coming, you know, we could see all of these signs in the past because we're living through it still. So many people view these as past atrocities, but we're literally doing the same exact thing in a different way, in a different place, but with the same goal, as you're saying, you know? And so we do have to be aware that what we're fighting against on all levels is that. We need to be prioritizing humanity and dignity and, you know, peaceful stability across the globe. And we don't have any leaders who seem to be doing that. We prioritize power,
money and power
a lot of times. And I just think that we've really lost our way as not just as our society, as Americans. Globally, we're in a bad way.
Well, the so-called Western civilization is in a bad way, largely because America has been such a drag on it. America has been really shining lots of lights on the contradictions of Western global hegemony lately. Unconditional support for Ukraine and condemnation of Russia, while at the same time almost unconditionally supporting Israel and condemning Palestine. This whole, I want to talk about this white genocide in South Africa thing for a little while, because I think, because as an indigenous person, I'm kind of interested in your take on it too, because the history of the word Boer comes from the term Trek Boer, which dates itself to the period between the takeover of South Africa by the British and the first Boer War with the Dutch colonists who had preceded the British. Now, the Trek Boers were people who had specifically left the populated suburbs of the major cities in South Africa when the British took over, in order to settle out in the so-called empty countryside as far away from other white people as possible, and lay claim to land under the British law that would then allow them to build their own political power as a class within the British system, and that basically made them guaranteed that they would be autonomous within the British system unless they were actually defeated somehow. And that's what the Boer Wars ended up being about, wars between the ruling class of the original Dutch colonists, the landowners who had been building up all of this autonomous infrastructure of their own so they wouldn't need the state, and the British colonial authorities who wanted to maintain control of the state. And it's important to note that this was a fight between white landed settlers and a militarized imperial nation state at the expense of the indigenous people of South Africa, who were fucked no matter who won. And this kill the Boer that people object to so violently because they're white and they think Boer means white South African, and they're not conversant on the history, do not understand that Boer refers to a ruling class identity in among Dutch South Africans, not just any white Afrikaner. There's a reason that Afrikaner and Boer are different words. They're not perfect synonyms.
Well, that is a great that was fantastic summarization. I got to say, really good. And you know, it is mirrored. It is almost a mirror image of how colonial violence has spread across the globe and how it's impacted indigenous people. Every time there are these legal forces that are abstract ideas that are created from, they're not real. Okay, let's be real, but they grant this power and this bravado to people to do and commit these atrocities, and then they don't face repercussions. And when you take somebody trying to resist that and they say kill the Boer, that is immediate. A lot of people know exactly what they mean. They're clear about what they mean, but because there is this ambiguity and because they can say, oh, look what they're saying, it's the same thing that a lot of us go through when we try to speak up. Our reaction is then weaponized, and we're painted as some illogical, savage, madman, right? That's what they want to go. Bloodthirsty. That's a good word.
For a black South African to say kill the Boer is less about white ethnicity than it is about someone in an American city, regardless of their race, who is, though admittedly racialized people are at far more risk. But white people need to look out too, because Portland is pretty white and it's being gentrified, and its working class population is being replaced by wealthier, whiter out of towners who think and vote more the right way.
Well, that's a great point that is actually worth bringing up. And this is something that I've been trying to get across to people. I've come up with an analogy, and I'm sure I'm not the first, but I like it. And that's, what? We've got poor white people. We've got, no matter what, intersectionality matters. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter the road you took to get to the ocean when you're both in the same boat, right? And that's the situation we find ourselves in. And we've got to not forget about it in terms of policy, because it matters how you got there. How you got there is, we got to address that to prevent other people from getting in that broken boat. But at the same time, we've got to deal with that material reality for people in the boat at the same time, maybe first, because there's a life-threatening aspect to it, existential crisis, right? And so that's what is homelessness. Need to remember.
You look at homelessness, and I was talking about this in one of the many arguments online about housing policy that always happen. But you look at homelessness and you realize, when you look at all the numbers and don't just look at the cherry pick stuff that people with agendas want you to look at, you realize that a few things are all true at the same time and that some of them contradict each other. One, we have more housing now than at any point in our nation's history. Two, that this is not somehow proportional to population growth. We have, by two different metrics, we have a surplus of housing. The first metric is what I would call the real metric, the population metric. The do we have enough extra room to sustain for growth metric. So by the do we have enough houses for all the people metric, we have more homes than we have households. That means in theory, every household in the country should be capable of being housed by the numbers. So number two, what I call the suffering metric, in almost every, there may be some exceptions, so I say almost to cover myself, but I haven't found any exceptions in any of the research I've done yet. But in almost every real estate market, we have more homes than we have more empty available homes than we have homeless people, which is to say that we have enough empty homes to house all the homeless people in any real estate market you can think of, and we choose not to do so for reasons of economics and quote-unquote public safety. And then you hear people say, well, we have a housing shortage and we just need to build more. Now, there's a massive environmental impact to constantly building housing just to tear it down and build more housing. And which raises the question, are there ways that we can use this housing surplus to house people before we start destroying our environment even more than we already are?
Well, that goes to the point that we value property more than human life.
Yes, and profit.
We obviously have the solution, okay? If you just look at things, and I always say, materially, what do people need? Houses. What do we have enough of? Houses. Problem, solution. It's right there. The problem comes in whenever people say, but who owns those houses? As though the right of, it's what John Locke's philosophy was all like, life, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and also your estate, your property. That's also a right that you have. And it's like all these other things are not.
Well, but let's remember too that John Locke specifically wrote a treatise on why Europeans had the right to indigenous land that basically completely invalidated his whole philosophy when it comes to people who had something he wanted.
I do love how they can twist themselves up into a knot in those time periods to say, oh, but not this group of people.
My favorite part, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Navajo are one of the peoples that I'm thinking of. The idea that the land was untilled before the Europeans got there completely ignores the fact of how many indigenous nations were agricultural.
Well, it wasn't. So this goes back to, what is it? Guns. Oh, geez, Louise, that guy.
Lawyers, Guns, and Money?
No. The one, Guns, Steel, and something or another. The guy who does the American history.
Oh, yeah.
About it. And he talks about how we didn't have cows. And that's why we were so far, everything was determined because we didn't have cows, obviously. But it was basically that idea.
Well, you had the buffalo. Oh, maybe that's why people killed the buffalo.
Well, but it's this idea that, also we had figured out ways to manage lands and resources in ways that didn't look like we're going to till this plot of land right here, exclusive, like they were doing in Europe. It didn't exactly resemble how they did it in Europe. So they said we were wasting the land, right?
The great joke of we were the first to till the land, which is ironically the same argument they use in Israel. We were the first to till the land. And it's the same thing in both places. They learned to actually farm under local conditions from indigenous peoples in the first place.
Right. It was always, from my understanding, it always seemed to be more, it doesn't look like what we do. Because it's not done the way that we do it, you're not doing it right. And so you're breaking what you owe to God or whatever.
The whole reason that there is an indigenous person with the anglicized name of Squanto, who is mentioned repeatedly in association with myths about the Pilgrim Fathers, is the fact that he taught them how to plant shit so it wouldn't die, because they weren't used to the local soil conditions and needed to learn about fertilizer. And he and other indigenous farmers taught them about fertilizer. And it's like, didn't till the land. stupid white people didn't know about fertilizer before we talked to an indigenous person.
Well, and that's the other thing too, is that every contribution is erased, right? So they bring in advancements for us, and then we become civilized people. Before that, we weren't, apparently. But that's the ongoing myth that allows for the genocide to continue. I firmly believe that what was happening is happening, and that the laws, again, everything comes back to these abstract notions, like the laws regarding blood quantum and what governs tribes, right, are going to eventually lead to the downfall of every single one of them.
Well, to trash the Democrats some more.
What's that?
Before Andrew Jackson and various Indian removal acts, there are whole towns in what's now Florida and South Carolina that are still intact, but used to have completely different people living there. The Cherokee were really big in South Carolina, and the Seminole were really big in Florida. And one of the reasons that they called them, quote unquote, civilized tribes is because they had very, very modern, by the time we're talking about, very modern conveniences combining the best of both their own indigenous civilization and white technology, and even adopting some of the worst parts of white society here and there. Some of these folks owned slaves. But Andrew Jackson relocated these folks to Oklahoma, which was then the quote-unquote Indian Territory, as they called it. And so we're talking about people who had built up this huge society in South Carolina and this huge society in Florida who were deported to Oklahoma so that white people could have their towns. And this is exactly the sort of shit that they're doing in Israel now. And this is why the U.S. supports this shit.
Well, and I want to go back to something you said there, because one of the things that is often brought up is the way in which Native peoples try to adapt to colonial rule. So one of the things that happened, paternalism became a problem within tribes. But really think about what it was happening when you have Europeans who will not deal with female elders or treat them as somebody that they can negotiate with, talk to. They're forcing this idea upon to the natives where they say, well, if we want any chance against this force to voice we've got to take on some of these structures. And it might not even be a conscious decision. It just emerges that way over the years of this repeated contact where women are devalued, right? And so they're not just imposing, I mean, it's kind of forced assimilation where you either do this or you're not sitting at the table. You're not getting a chance to even talk to us. You either take on this aspect of our culture or you're not even worth talking.
You look at the way Christianity was forced on indigenous people everywhere.
That's a big one for me. I can't tell, like, so
and then what does Christianity say? Well, Christianity says be a functional part of society and follow the rules in its modern context. And so you're by making people Christians, you're basically using a religious cudgel to force them into a white style society.
Well, and it's not. Here's the other thing too. So this one is the one that gets me. Is I don't know if this will make sense or if it's just in my head. But let me put this out there. Contact with native peoples happened, late 1400s. That well documented. That's when all of this really started, right? Into the 1500s.
Portuguese in Africa and India is where it really started, I guess you could say. Yeah, and that was all 1400s.
Right. So let's go ahead and take this out, right? What was going on in Europe at that time? I mean, we really weren't even at the stage where we're talking about territorial nation states in
Europe. So in Europe at the time, and I'm going to use this word because it's the sort of thing that other white people absolutely hate. Not because I'm knocking any specific way of life, but it was very much a tribe and property driven society, Europe, Race in Europe before the colonization of the Americas and Africa. Race in Europe was about tribal relations. The people of England were a different tribe from the people of Scotland or Ireland or France. The people of Spain and Portugal were of different tribes, so the attempts to combine them under the same king in the 14 and 1500s didn't ultimately work out. This notion that our nationhoods were based on a combination of tribal affiliations and property ownership, with the tribal affiliation of the property owners becoming the nation, as ultimately expressed by kings and feudalism. And this was expressed in lots of different ways. And the bourgeois pushing against feudalism is why you see the period of absolute monarchy break out for a while in the 14 and 1500s. And then you see the Enlightenment, and you see the bourgeois turn against monarchy, and you see the big Republican awakening.
Right, and that's my point. So all of this is happening at the same time that colonization in the Americas is going on, a lot of it.
And the discovery and invention of whiteness, and the idea that, well, maybe the English and the Dutch are actually the same race, and the French really aren't that different from the English and the Dutch, and the Germans are just Dutch people with a funny accent. This starts to take hold, and now you get the invention of whiteness as pan-Europeanism in a world where Europe is trying to dominate the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly. But my point is this, though. When we talk about, even when we're talking about it here, there's still almost this.
But you're right in that they're not nation states. It was all about tribe, right, in the sense of family relationships, the oldest meaning of tribe, and property ownership.
Right. Right. And so, but that's my point, is that when you talk about American history, when we're talking about genocide, any of this stuff, colonial violence, it's like we're talking about, it's been a long time. And I think that people often overlook that while people are coming up with political philosophy and building nations that resemble what we have today in Europe, that people in America, indigenous people, were already being subjected to colonial violence, right?
And as we mentioned with John Locke, the great thinkers of the Enlightenment were actively justifying and celebrating the colonial violence that completely violated their so-called enlightened philosophies.
Right.
The republicanism of the Dutch during the long Dutch Republican period coincided with the Dutch Empire. The Dutch Empire wasn't under the Dutch monarchy in more recent years, because the Dutch monarchy has only been around since after Napoleon. No, the Dutch Empire was coincident with the Dutch Republic.
Right. And so, so this is my point. We get this idea that tribal identity or native identity is this thing, and it would look like what it did way back in the 1400s, right?
Yeah.
But we've all been around for this transition globally in what society has become. So there is we would have modernized had we been allowed to participate and join in. We would definitely have changed our structure.
Again, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, they did modernize, and they still got screwed.
Well, no, but that's my point, is to think that we're somehow outside of this. Like, people need to really contextualize the way that we were marginalized, subjugated, targeted, and kept from these things as they were evolving. It wasn't already set in stone when people got here. That's what you know what I mean?
Yeah, so no, it's nobody. When people were setting up, and this is really the first quote unquote democratic expression of discontent with the colonial government, was a demand to be able to kill more indigenous people and take more land in Virginia.
Right. And it's always been this there's this secret power behind the settlers that really gets overlooked. The way that it was legalized to do these atrocities. Benjamin Madley, a guy I talked to on an old podcast, he's in California, professor. He did a book called "The American Genocide: The Catastrophe." Look it up; it's a great book. And he told me directly, if you took this same method and applied the same rigorous investigative techniques that he put into his work in California, if you took it to any state and did the same thing, you're going to find the same atrocities.
So
it's not
fun fact.
No.
Fun fact. There are very good critical works from both indigenous and communist points of view by different authors at different times, studying the California mission system that is so highly celebrated as an example of, the friendly and peaceful coexistence between the Spaniards and the indigenous peoples. They were so much better at it than the English were. And you see these people comparing Father Junipero Serra, who founded the first missions, to Hitler in his management of indigenous labor, and comparing indigenous communities within the mission system as concentration camps where people were put into forced labor for the good of the colonial elite.
Right. And that's what always gets me with all of the time periods, big thinkers, is that they create this narrative for people to justify their own greatness or justify their actions against a king, let's say.
Yeah.
But what they purport to be universal truths or universal rights never apply to everyone universally. And they've always got some big high-minded reason why.
One of the big reasons for the American Revolutionary War in the first place was the future of what eventually they started to call the Ohio Territory, and what at the time of the Revolutionary War colonists and the British government in the colonies tended to call the Northwest Territory, which is basically the Northwest Territory is basically the modern post-industrial Midwest. Ohio particularly. But one of the key disputes was that the British government was preventing white settlers from colonizing Ohio and ethnically cleansing the area and making it another colony.
Right. I mean, that's the way we've I've had this discussion so many times, and people will refuse to put the genocide label on what happened to indigenous people. And it blows my mind considering what we can
see. What is happening to indigenous people. There's a reason that they find more missing white girls than they do missing indigenous girls. And it's not because there are fewer missing indigenous girls per capita.
Right. It's just this ongoing violence against Native peoples. And this is the scary thing. In 100 years, a fair number of tribes will cease to exist because membership will cease to be viable for nobody will meet the blood quantum.
Yeah, I've noticed this, and I'm glad to have you talking about this, because this is something this is something that is not easy for me to necessarily talk about without having someone with more knowledge and perspective. I know that a lot of tribes are going back to blood quantum as a way, as the final say on whether someone is actually an indigenous person or not, as opposed to the more traditional and less potentially eugenic from the point of view of the white people too, because remember, when you're going by blood quantums, that gives the white man something to use against you too.
Okay, so this is something that I've been waiting to talk about this with somebody. So let me go ahead. This is so complicated. It's not easy because there are two very distinct things that you've got to consider. One, pretendians, people who will
Yes.
claim to be indigenous despite having no connection to the tribe, no ancestry,
and a
it could be
shocking
an
number
indigenous-
of people, who were fairly famous have actually been outed as pretendians in recent years, including one of the biggest singers in Canada.
Right. And so there's that aspect of it. Or people who get a DNA test and have no affiliation with a tribe, who,
Yes.
5% or whatever, and they're like, now I'm indigenous. But there is also an aspect of, well, we are definitely a people, right?
Yeah.
There is definitely some genetic determination in some regards because we are a people. So, but this whole idea of racialization of identity.
Well, and if you want to take it a step further, I mean, you also have in every, especially in red states, but really in every society anyway, because capitalism has been forced on peoples. But in every society, you have guys like the character Fred Ward plays in Thunderheart, who's based on a real person who was leading a real sort of right-wing political movement in the Oglala reservation system during the real period in which Leonard Peltier went to prison. And I kid you not, the organization set up by the local capitalist in bed with the local rich white guys to protect his power was called the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, for short, Goon. So, I mean, you've in every system, because of the way colonialism works, you have these people who have tribal citizenship and in many cases tribal power, but who are total, to use their own words, goons for the white guy.
Right. I mean, like I said, this is like really difficult to parse out.
And are the goons, and I'm not the right person to ask this, obviously, but where do the goons stand in all this blood quantum versus citizenship talk?
Well, and we can't gloss over the fact that the government has incentivized tribes to have higher blood quantum for tribal membership.
Yes, they've actually declared tribes in California and Massachusetts non-existent for not having enough people who can pass blood tests.
Right. So this is nefarious on that level, right? In that, and we got to be careful too, because if you say, well, it's about tribal affiliation, well, you know what? Here's something that you got to think about. The forced assimilation policies of the last century. We had a large number of people who were removed from the reservations and put into white society with the intent of making them, members
the
urban,
of what used to be referred to as the urban Indian population, people who had been deculturized by growing up in the white inner city, essentially.
My grandmother was removed from her home and put into a boarding school in Denver.
Yes.
And lived and stayed off and on with a family there. I want to say Mormons, but don't quote me on that. And so that's where I come from. She met my grandfather. He was in the Army. They moved back to West Virginia.
Well, to the Mormons, you're one of the lost tribes of Israel.
Yes, we are. And listen, I could get. There's listen, the Navajo Nation and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a weird relationship dynamic these days, and I just can't get past. I listen. I don't want to talk about it, but
fair enough.
But to the other points we've got to remember. I want to see a movement of diaspora natives reconnecting with their tribes, and for tribes to be fully accepting of that outreach. Because if we could connect those who were lost with what was lost, we could have a vast network of tribal peoples across the nation.
Yeah.
We could expand our power significantly by encouraging those people to run for office, to get involved in their communities, and to push indigenous issues to the forefront. So in my mind, if we do this right, There is a way to take that forced assimilation and turn that into a weapon against the forces that are trying to keep us from maintaining our existence.
The problem with that, of course, is that if you succeed too well by following the rules you're supposed to follow, and you're not part of the appropriate in-group, then the rules get changed. The best example I can think of is look at how many different ways China has been able to adapt to the neoliberalism imposed on it by the West and still manage to turn the exploitation of its status into a net material gain for its people is something that really pisses the West off. And now they're constantly complaining at how successful China has been by doing all the things that it was told to do by the West.
Right, exactly. You know, and so there's a lot of hubris, ego. They get arrogant in the way that they go about things. And I think that ultimately can become a strength if done correctly.
In at least one cyberpunk dystopia, when the indigenous people start to get enough material power in society to try to protect themselves from the predation of their resources, it ends up being another war.
You're not, listen, I mean, listen, all of these things are true. This is the point of everything that I do, is that we are at the precipice, I believe, as a civilization worldwide, where we're either going to start declining.
What was it Marx and Engels said? Socialism or barbarism?
I was unfamiliar with that quote specifically. I think that's very, very, very wise, because to me, you're seeing, okay, this is, we're talking about theorists today. And one that always stuck with me was Hobbes, right?
Yes.
And he says the state of nature is basically material insecurity drives most conflict. But then his solution was to institutionalize the violence and make sure the appropriate people are subjected to it. Instead of, and again, you know, his time period, you couldn't really suggest this, but let's say he's right. And material insecurity is the main driving factor of conflict and violence in our society. Then finding a way to facilitate material security seems to be the best way to find a stable worldwide peace. We're at the place now where we're devolving. We're seeing more and more conflict, and it's getting really terrifying.
So this
got to make a change.
This is something that I'm very interested in, the concept of apocalypse, because the concept of apocalypse is fundamental to the Anabaptist tradition that I grew up in. And the idea that, well, it's okay because we're going to heaven is not something that the first Anabaptists were really willing to accept. The idea is, well, you can't just sit back and live your normal life during an apocalypse. If the world is ending, then you got to do your part to make a new heaven and a new earth. And that was the fundamental idea behind the seizure of power in the city of Munster, is that the Anabaptists believed that things like the religious wars in Germany at the time meant that the world really was ending, and it was part of their duty to build that better society for the new earth that would come when this one ended. And so they did silly things that later got used against them as propaganda, but when you really think about it, were remarkably forward thinking. Like, you know, they took over the government and they went around and they asked all the married women, well, are you happy? No? Well, would you rather live with someone else? Yeah, who? Okay, we'll take you over there. And they got accused of things like supporting polygamy, which is technically true, because if two women said they wanted to live with the same man, they would let the two women and the man sort that out however they wanted, rather than impose some system on those people from outside. And they did the same thing with kids. How are your parents treating you? Are you happy? Are you okay? And if the kids said, no, I'm not okay, they said, okay, where would you like to go? And the kids said, and they would take them there. So there's this idea that, well, they're taking people's kids and practicing polygamy. Well, okay, maybe, but they're asking women and children what they want, and then making regulatory decisions based on what the people most subject to family violence say they want to see in their own family. Letting the people who will have to bear the consequences of any violence decide where they want to live and what home they want to be positioned in.
You know, to go to that point of apocalypse, I think there's another aspect of that I don't know, doesn't get talked about enough. How much of our world policy, our global foreign policy, for anybody, pick your nation, wherever you're at, is driven by people who believe in end times teachings, and that maybe they want to bring about the conditions of revelation to make
it seems like that sometimes. I mean, to mention a church that got name dropped before, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, colloquially known as the Mormons. The many Southern Baptists who are aggressively not free will Baptists, but who are very Calvinist and predestinarian in their outlook, which is where their prosperity gospel stuff comes from. Conservative Catholics who see Catholicism as symbolic of colonial whiteness and a very specific kind of entrenched establishment power. I mean, let's remember the long history of anti-clericalism in various anti-colonial and left-wing political movements, for the simple fact that in situations like the California missions, the priests were the ones running the genocide and not the military. And in situations like Mexico and Spain, the repressive landlords were often monks or nuns. I mean, the story that nobody likes to hear about the Spanish Civil War is that they weren't killing priests and nuns because they were priests and nuns. This goes back to Kill the Boer and the fact that priests and nuns were at risk because they were huge institutional landlords responsible for misery and death.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key aspects that people overlook in conversations even today about policy, is that a lot of times people are dying because of bad policy.
Yes.
We don't consider that to be a cost or really a metric by which to measure effectiveness, or
not if the right people are dying. I mean, nobody colonizing the Americas was terribly concerned about too many indigenous people dying, except some priests who wrote some books that made the Pope impose some rules.
Yeah, so I mean, you got hundreds of years of examples of what we shouldn't do moving forward, right? That's a positive spin.
I think that it is, but you also see people, they sort of justify their whole outlook by this idea of Western civilization equals a positive developmental good that cannot be lost. And if you really want to save Western civilization, why are you not cooperating with the people who are suffering from it to save everybody?
Exactly. And how do you not realize that a crumbling foundation leads to trouble for the whole, right?
I mean, and ultimately, I think, and this goes back to that word apocalypse. Worlds end and are created anew a lot in history. And I don't want to be too metaphysical, but you can take the concept of apocalypse and apply it to a theory of history where the fall of Rome is the end of the world and the beginning of a new one. The discovery of America is by Europeans. Obviously, indigenous people already knew it was there; they were living there. But I mean, the European awareness of America was the end of one world and the beginning of a new one. Ultimately, it led to industrial revolutions that were the end of one world and the beginning of a new world, which itself led to world wars that were the end of one world and the beginning of a new world. And what was the Cold War? But what was the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War? But the end of one world and the beginning of a new one. I mean, this apocalypse stuff is always applicable in the sense that we're always needing to make something new here on Earth.
Well, that's the other thing, isn't it? That's the nature of evolution. That's the nature of learning from past mistakes and building upon them, right? So to me, it makes sense that you got to always adapt to the situation as it's occurring and what the reality for people is. And people get so hung up on like I said, these abstract ideas that they hold to be so relevant that ultimately lead to people dying. But to them, those deaths aren't as important as maintaining that structure or that system that's they perceive as creating stability and peace.
There are two separate ways of looking at things, and I see the difference between these two ways more and more. And this has to do with Marxism, but it also has to do with things like historical materialism and the question of dialectics and how people think, even removed from Marxist ideas specifically. Because one way of looking at the world is that history particularly, is that history is the story of people and events, and that these events are events. Something happened on such a time at such a date. And then there's another way of looking at history where history is an ongoing process by which we record what's happening to us. And that this, rather than being a series of events that are defined by what happens on a specific date, history is an ongoing process that tells the story of how people are living. And some of these processes are things like apocalypse and the forced change on large groups of people that are essentially the creation of a new heaven and new earth. Because what's being colonized, if not being forced to live in hell?
Yeah, that's very true. I think anybody who's been subjected to that would agree to that.
But I mean, I think that it's really important to think scientifically about some of these religious words and what they really mean in a historical sense, and then to think of it, and then to try to synthesize that with the best of atheist thought. George Carlin said it very well, and I think about it a lot lately. Save the planet. What do you mean save the planet? The planet will be fine. People are fucked, but the planet will be fine.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, by the way. I mean, I think that if we don't change, and I mean globally, like I can't do it, you can't do it. Everybody is responsible for their own little piece of the world, but hopefully what we need to see is like some
Well,
real radical
ultimately, I think that the
reformation.
reason that history is failing, for lack of a better word, is that our story can't seem to get to the point where, instead of everybody being responsible for their little piece of the world, society takes collective responsibility for the world in which we live and the people who have to live in it.
Well, right. I mean, like I said, we can only do so much. We can affect around us,
Yeah.
but it takes leaders. It is going to take the leadership of the world to collectively put in some effort and to reject the things that are killing us. And I mean,
And at some point, it becomes necessary to get rid of leaders who are unable to do that.
well, like I said, it's going to take leadership to do it. So
Yes.
whoever needs to be in that position, however they need to get in that position, that's who's going. It's that movement. It's hard. So we do have some individual action, and that's let's get some change in here. We talked about before. I said electorally, we're not
Sure.
fixing this necessarily, and you said, well, you got to have a political mechanism, and I agree wholeheartedly. My point is that doing things the way we've been doing them isn't working anymore. I don't know if I've said this on your show, but I've likened where we are right now, especially in America, to hyper normalization at the fall of the Soviet Union. We're just trying to continue to let the process play out. Let's see. Okay, we're going to work on this, and we're going to eventually get somebody in there and make things right again. But I think we're losing way faster than we could ever recover under the current mechanisms and systems that we have in place.
Well, I mean, it's so much easier to break things using the American system than it is to build anything that lasts.
That's a great way
You
to put it.
see Trump's attack on the bureaucracy that allows government to do things ultimately makes the government more dependent on federal contractors and the landlords who own and operate those federal contractors, which means people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and that the guy who's actually CEO of Thiel's company Palantir now, Alex Karp. Horrible people who want to do horrible things to ordinary people to justify their own power and their own worldview. And these are the wealthy and powerful people who have influence with our politicians, regardless of political party, is these billionaires who give massive amounts of money.
Yeah. I mean, we're, no, it's not good. We're not in a good place. Anyone, anywhere, really. And complete lack of a complete failure from anybody to really try to put forth the work that would improve situations for the majority of people. I mean, we've got those people instead making policy that enriches them, builds themselves up at the expense of people, and they know it's at the expense of people. There's no way they don't.
There was a period in the late 1960s and early 1970s in West Germany. It started in 1966 with what was called the Grand Coalition, in which after an election in which neither side could make a government on its own, and which neither side could make a government with minor parties because of the way Parliament was so, the German Parliament was so evenly locked up. The Christian Democratic Union, the German version of the Republican Party for our language, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, who in German parlance are liberal Democrats, but who historically are in theory socialist and pro-labor, but it hasn't worked out that way for a very long time, had to form a government together in order for there to be a government. And the man that they made Chancellor of Germany, and it's so hilarious that this wasn't a joke. The guy they made Chancellor of Germany was the former deputy director of propaganda for the Nazi Foreign Service Office under Ribbentrop. And he was now the Chancellor of Germany because of a coalition government between the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats. And at this point, the student youth movement in Germany began to realize, not too long after he became chancellor, that the Nazis were running the West German state again, and that the German federal cops were actively trying to kill student protesters. It was like the Nazis are in charge and they're going to kill us. At which point they organized what became known as the Baader-Meinhof gang, or the German Red Army faction, though it's worth noting that their name in German would actually translate more properly into the Red Army fraction than faction, because they believed they were the revolutionary percentage of society that would light the fire for everybody else, so to speak. And they did what the government of West Germany at the time called terrorism. They kidnapped rich people and attacked right-wing newspapers and went after the cops. But keep in mind, these were the cops who were shooting student protesters in the head with real bullets. And in the end, the original leaders all ended up in prison and all died in so-called suicides while awaiting trial. And then an ex-CIA agent sort of talked about how, well, I don't think it was really suicide because, and then there were very public accusations, credible accusations against the West German state for murdering these guys. And it's worth noting that this is the same West German state whose cops made a decision in 1976 at the Munich Olympics to go in and kill the people who took hostages, even though they knew that would mean all the hostages would be killed, and that many of the hostages would be killed by gunfire from their so-called rescuers. These are the West German cops we're talking about, the same West German cops who killed everybody at Munich, basically. And they were just being let loose on the student movement. Does this sound familiar or applicable in any way to any American history now?
Oh, man. I mean, it's so wild how you get all of this nonsense growing up about how far we've come. And, they treated Nazism as this relic of the past that we overcame through a ideological battle. And
they lied about that. They were lying about that. They were deliberately lying about that. They themselves settled the Nazis among their own people as a means of making American and Canadian and South African and Argentinian society more right-wing.
And people get surprised that there is this strain of new wave Nazism in American.
But the thing to remember is that it's generational. It's not actually new. Best example, the big argument about whether or not Elon Musk really did a Nazi salute when he did his whole arm thing. Well, let's look at Elon Musk's family. Not so much the Musk side of it, but his mom's family. His mother's father was arrested in 1940. So keep in mind, this is after World War I. Canada, as part of the United Kingdom in those days, was actively fighting in World War II as of 1940. Elon Musk's Canadian grandfather on his mother's side was arrested in 1940 for his activity in association with the Canadian Nazi group. In 1950, he moved his family to South Africa because he liked apartheid. So Elon Musk's mother, May, was raised in South Africa by a Canadian Nazi who moved his family to South Africa because he wanted to raise his children under apartheid.
Right. I mean, that's the point, is that it never died. It's always been.
So now you look at it another way. Elon Musk's mother is a second-generation Canadian Nazi. Now, the next logical, Elon Musk, independent from but connected to his South African baggage, is a third generation Canadian Nazi.
Yeah, that's undeniable. I think you can, none of what you said.
But you have to actually look at that family history and realize his grandfather was arrested in 1940 while Canada was at war with Nazi Germany for being a Nazi. And now he's a Nazi. His mother was raised by a Nazi in South Africa under Nazi conditions so that she too would become a Nazi. And now her kid's a Nazi.
You know, one of the things that really bothers me too is the media's refusal to fully embrace that angle of
well, so
they give that out for him.
On that topic, there is a book that was written in the 1970s by an American writer of spy thrillers named Robert Ludlum called The Holcroft Covenant, in which an American lawyer whose father was a Nazi war criminal inherits a Nazi fortune and finds himself being told that he's inheriting this fortune because he's supposed to use it because his father felt guilty and wanted to do great good in the world to make up for the crimes of Nazi Germany. Except this whole fortune he's inheriting and the story he's being told about it are a front for a Nazi military future operation called Operation Sonnenkinder, in which they're trying to get all these children of people who were Nazis into good families so that they'll grow up to be good Nazis in positions of power in America. I invite everyone to read the Holcroft Covenant and then look at Elon Musk and select other billionaires in American society and the thinking of the political philosophers that they have surrounded themselves with and subsidized. But Elon Musk is actually a Sonnenkinder if you really think about it that way.
Very well put. I agree with everything you just said, by the way. I think that more people need to be aware of the context and who these people really are. And we got to stop treating things like they're, especially public relations things. When you got these people, any statement they make, anything that comes out about them has been put through 8 rounds of people to make sure it's fine. You don't get a lot of real insight into who they are. And so historically, we have evidence of why Elon's out there doing what he did, and we can draw our own conclusions upon it. But, you know, when he says it, it's definitely not that thing. It wasn't that thing, but we all know it was. We all have evidence to back up why we would believe that. And we've got to start using that critical thinking at all levels.
He wants to pretend that somehow things that he's said and done are somehow not in context with the idea, with the immediate idea that it's obviously a Nazi salute, when everything he has done for most of his life is in context with the idea that, yes, absolutely, it was a Nazi salute.
I literally can't see any reason people would think it wasn't a Nazi salute if you knew nothing about the guy. Just watching the video.
In what other situation? I mean, who else salutes like that?
And forcefully, I could understand if you throw your hand up for a wave and you're like waving. That's not what he did at all. He made side by side with Hitler. It's identical to the motion, to the
action. And for all the people who were trying to say Roman salute, so we don't actually know how the Romans saluted. They didn't have photographs in those days. We don't have any pictures of Roman soldiers saluting anybody, so we don't know how Romans saluted. What we do know is that in the 1920s, both the Italian Fascist Party and the German Nazi Party adopted a quote-unquote Roman salute as an internal thing, and that Roman salute was then imposed on culture by fascists. I also know, as a bit of post-occupation history, that the reason all the Romans in the famous French comic book Asterix do what looks like a Nazi salute is because the creators of the comic strip were deliberately trying to draw a parallel between the Nazi occupation of France and the Roman occupation of Gaul. And so this whole Roman salute bullshit is just cover up for something. Well, yeah, the Nazis called it a Roman salute too. What's your point?
Well, and also that, to me, it's transitive property, right? If they said it was a Roman salute, then it's the same thing.
Yeah,
you're using the same exact logic they used. You're not making the case that you're not
proving you're not a Nazi.
Right. I mean, so that one always got me too. Like, it's just so funny. Like, what is it? I'm saying hello. Is it a Roman salute? It doesn't matter what you call it. The message was clear. And the fact that he's running from it, at least immediately after, shows that there's still some hope.
And now this is recent news too. Now he's made a big deal of writing what's essentially an open letter to his SpaceX investors, saying he's coming home to do his job properly and isn't going to be meddling in government operations anymore. Which is basically saying, I'm going to try real hard not to do anything more to hurt you guys.
Well, by his own measure, I mean, Doge was very authoritarian. If you weren't doing your job right, you got to go. So I would hope that the people at Tesla take that same approach when assessing Elon Musk's performance. I don't know what power they have over him, what the structure and governance is like, but I come on. He did damage to that company, to the workers at that company. I'm not. Well, there's no way around that. That's just wild.
Well, the idea that you can somehow make government more efficient by firing a whole bunch of people is just, buying into a right-wing lie in the first place, that government is somehow less efficient than private enterprise. When really the least efficient thing about government right now is how much of it is actually carried out by private contractors who are being paid to do the work by the government, instead of the government maintaining its own working class character. Part of the government maintaining its working class character is not privatizing the welfare state, for instance.
I mean, yeah, when you think about privatization, it's so clearly just a way to get somebody rich off of the services the government.
And more than that, you're replacing allegedly democratic representative government with authoritarian corporate government that only cares about short-term profits from quarter to quarter.
Right. And I mean, you remove all accountability from the government officials for what's carried out by if something ends up coming up, we say, oh, we got a bad contractor, but they had the best bid. We chose it.
And then you get to circle back to the situation in West Virginia, then you end up with these situations where the governance of the political party in any given state sees itself as fundamentally corporate in its operating capacity and philosophy, and leading from the top down, rather than seeing itself as political and democratic and moving from the bottom up.
Just take a look at the way people responded to my calling out of the party's actions this time. Nobody was covering this story. The party wasn't publicizing the fact they removed all those people. I got out there and said, hey, everybody pay attention to this. This is something. I'm a former Democratic Party official. I've been impacted by similar things. Look at what's happening, right? And the response widely was, why is Seth Sturm able to go talk about that? Why is he speaking for us? Why is Seth Sturm out there? He has no right. Why don't I have a right? I am a person who is impacted by the things that you're doing.
You're not part of their corporate club anymore.
First of all, I was never in the club.
Well, but what I mean is that you were someone who they saw as a useful tool at a certain time and place, and their whole reason for wanting a West Virginia Indigenous Peoples Caucus was instrumental to other things that they wanted. And so rather than being part of the club, you were necessary to their instrumentalization in their minds. Which is why when you didn't cooperate, you became the enemy.
Well, you see, here's the funny thing. They knew I wasn't going to cooperate. The person who was doing all of this, I had a history with. And so that very first meeting, she had tried so hard, contacted every person that had signed up for the meeting and other people, apparently, trying to get people to run against me and my sister. And that became a thing in and of itself, because people in the Indigenous Caucus were like, who is this person? Why is she writing us? And I'm like, well, listen, that's a long story. So,
that's a very good question. Let's talk about that.
Well, and that's why I did this caucus in the first place, because I was told specifically, if you don't do this, they're going to get somebody not Indigenous to just run the caucus.
Yes.
And so I said, all right, I'll do it. I didn't want to do it. I had truly didn't want to do it. Yeah. And that's why a lot of this happened unfolded naturally. I had no idea what I was coming into. I had no idea what these people were plotting. And it took a while for me to fully uncover what was going on. And, ever since then, it's just been a battle. And I hope that we're finally at a place where we see some accountability. I really do. It would be a tremendous way for me to gracefully exit from my tenure at the Democratic Party, as I'll say it that way, So I'm looking forward.
Well, I keep thinking, and I'm sorry if this is in any way an unflattering association, but I keep thinking of the Godfather Part 3, where Michael says, I was out and they kept pulling me back in.
Well, I'll tell you, last week.
But if you actually watch, though, he's not so much being pulled back in as nature abhors a vacuum. And if he's not actively running things, that means someone else will be.
It's a very good comparison just on the surface level, too, because I'm telling you, for a year, I have just stepped away. What can I do? I've tried. I've done my level best. And then last Thursday, I got a call at 11:30 at night. And the person said, I need to talk to you. And we stayed on the phone till almost 5 a.m. And by the end of it, I had determined, okay, I'm coming back for a minute, because nobody else is picking up this story. Nobody's running with it, and nobody's really helping strategize a way to hold the party accountable and secure a win that means something for those people impacted. And again, I see this as an opportunity for me to show that what we had discussed, what we had been saying was true. Make it clear that the smear campaigns, what's the word I want to use, but this response from the party to intimidate people for standing up and speaking out has got to come to an end. This is a party that, especially in West Virginia, has no power. We have no representative. We have 2 senators out of 34. We have, I think, 8 or 9 representatives out of 100 some. This is not
one of the so-called progressives became a Republican because of his not very progressive ideas about trans rights.
Right, and these are the people that we're dealing with on a regular basis, is these Democrats who don't know how to navigate a world where right-wing propaganda and ideology has taken such a strong hold on the It has. People are really buying into all of the negative things that are said, but you have to remember why that is. Reactionary politics thrives in a situation where the populace is desperate. They need somebody to.
And what have West Virginia Democrats been doing for people in West Virginia lately?
That's the point. Go look at their press releases. Everything is always some platitude. It's got the chair making these big, bold statements against Trump or these national issues, or they're attacking Patrick Morrisey in West Virginia. But you know what?
They keep voting with the Republicans in the actual bills. It's like, okay, you can't win, but why would you vote on record with the Republicans here?
It is, and they just lack the I just think it's a lack of leadership and a lack of real clarity for what they want other than their own position.
And it's not just a one state problem or a red state problem. Democrats in Washington in 2023 passed a law allowing teachers who just had to stick their nose into other people's business to out queer kids to their parents. Now, I think it's really important to say, when we are talking about anti-queerness and how it can express itself in families, when you out a queer kid to parents that they haven't told, you are risking the kid's life.
That's hearing one of the things that I'm so vocal about is the issue of LGBTQ rights, specifically trans rights these days, because they're some of the most attacked people.
Well, because the idea is, and sadly the Democrats are buying into the Republican thinking here. The Republican thinking is, this is such a tiny percentage of the population that we will not ever lose anything by attacking trans people. We will not ever lose a single voter we actually want by attacking trans people because there aren't enough of them. So we need to make trans people out to be the cause of everybody else's problems, because, it's a no-lose situation for us. And the only way to prove that wrong is for people to stand up for trans people in the way that we would hope someone would stand up for us when it becomes our turn to lose our rights.
And, I've been asking people this question, and I've not gotten a good answer yet. Has there ever been a time in history when a group of people was targeted with state power, either punitive, exclusionary, or violence directly, that was justified based on a shared identity? It's just not something that has ever turned out. It turns out it results in atrocities.
You'll find people who will say that the atrocities of one side justify the other side using state power to target them and do their own atrocities.
Right. No, absolutely you will. But at the end of the day, though, which group in the past that we have had historical data for has been targeted justly?
Nazis.
Again,
Nazis have been targeted justly, but they haven't been targeted enough.
But that's the thing, is that ideologically, it's not necessarily a real identity feature. That's an ideology. But here's the second thing.
True.
They weren't punished. As we talked about, they were integrated. The people were
far too often. There's never been realistic denazification. The same thing happened in the American South. The Reconstruction that was supposed to make a new society in the Old South ended up meekly stepping away and letting the former Confederates take power again.
Right. That's it. And so I just think we've got to get to a place, and this is the other thing people got to remember. When framed as a general statement, do you support trans rights and trans people's journey? Yes. It's like 65-70% of the American people. When you start getting specific, when you start creating an editorial,
and if you ask specific questions like, do you believe people's lives should be made harder because they're trans? You'll see people say no, like, even 80-90% of the time.
Right. So there's a disconnect in what people are thinking and the policies that are getting enacted. And like I said, Democrats ceding this point instead of leading on it is a major mistake, because this is something that could easily be turned from an issue that affects, like you said, a small number of people into one that's a universal statement.
Well, to look at your point of, when has the government, when targeting one group of people, ever, stopped with that group of people? They didn't stop with disabled people or communists or socialists or trade unionists or queer people in Germany. They went on to Jewish people and anybody who stood up to the government.
Right. And you can tell that's what the plan is here as well. I mean, we're testing the waters for removing rights in the way in which we're doing it. And I really do believe it's that stark. It's not just, well, this is a great,
like this whole thing where we're disappearing people for their bad politics, supporting Palestine too much and Israel not enough. I mean, this is precisely the sort of thing that has been historically associated with fascism, disappearing people for their political beliefs. This is the historical anti-communism that leads to fascism in a different form. We're seeing these Islamic terrorist grievance myths assume the same power that Judeo-Bolshevik grievance myths assumed in the language and thinking of Hitler's Nazis.
No, and that's what I said. There are so many parallels that you can draw, and the fact that people are still hesitant to make them. Like I said, we're going to hyper normalize ourselves into a really dire situation here. And people, the worst part is that I think the American people aren't necessarily for all of this in the way that it's being enacted, even if they think they are.
Well, again, I mean,
even by their standards.
You ask people, if you ask people whether they support Israel or support Palestine, you get slightly more than 50% are still saying support Israel in that sort of abstract way. But if you ask, do you approve of what the Israeli military is doing to Gaza right now? Then you get these huge numbers saying fuck no. And there's a huge disconnect between, 50% of the population having this vague idealistic idea of I support Israel to the concrete and material. Do you support what's happening in Gaza? And 90% of the population emphatically says fuck no.
Well, because they've created this situation where you ask if you support Israel, people automatically assume you're talking about any Israeli right to existence in this time.
Well, by that argument, Hamas supports Israel.
Hey, I'm with it. That's fine by me.
I'm not, but I mean, I'm just saying, it's like, if you're okay, so by that by that argument, even Hamas has acknowledged Israel's right to exist. So what the fuck more do you want?
But that's the thing, is people aren't thinking in these great, they don't even really follow it, right? Like, so many people are just vibing.
And I mean, I can say, and I've said before, and I will say before, that no, I don't actually believe any state has a right to exist, particularly settler constructs like Israel or Australia or the United States or Canada. But all of that aside, in a legalistic international law sense, Hamas recognizes Israel's fucking right to exist. What do you want?
I think they want Gaza and the West Bank wholly. I think that is
well, that's the thing, is they want everything, and they want the Palestinians to not be their problem anymore. They just want to be able to remove the Palestinians from what they think of as Israeli society and not ever have to see or hear or think about them or be bothered by them.
Right. And again, that's their main, it's like, again, it's the same colonial goal that they had with indigenous people. They don't really care if we're all dead, so long as they have the vast majority of the territory and they control the culture and the legal system. That's what it's all about, right? Really, is about maintaining that power, and subjugating people is a way to do that. And culture is so important to maintaining your power.
Yeah.
In America, our culture says patriotism, respect the Congress, respect the presidency, the Constitution is an infallible document, all of that. That's our culture. That's what we're raised to try to believe. And it's specifically made in a way that protects the state interest. And so that aspect of it is.
But is it really our culture, or is it the ruling class's culture? Now, that's a question for another show, but that's a good place to stop, I think.
Fantastic.
Is it really our culture, or is it the ruling class's culture? And that's something to think about through the week ahead, especially as people throw words like culture war around. Okay, but what does the culture war really represent, and who's the enemy we're really fighting when we engage in what people call the culture war? And maybe that's a topic for its own show somewhere down the line. I would love for you to be able to sit in on that. Do you have any final thoughts or plugs before I give mine?
I will just say, everybody, watch what's happening in West Virginia if you care about what's happening with the DNC. It's all very much tied together.
And after you watch what's happened in West Virginia, folks, look at what's happening in your state, in your local DNC or RNC, and see if it looks at all the same. And if it does, how can you draw attention to it and agitate for actual democracy in our society? On that note, my final thoughts are always the same. You can find, if you want to support the show, you can follow the Eclectic Rad and Eclectic Radical on Twitter. I'm Eclectic Radical on Patreon and Substack. And I am Eclectic Radical on YouTube. If you wanted to make a one-time donation, I am Eclectic Radical on both PayPal and Cash. Though if you're asking me where to donate, Cash decided to not do business with PayPal anymore. So it's probably best, if you want to make a one-time donation, to do it to PayPal and not Cash. At least until I decide which one to keep and which one to get rid of. But right now, Patreon Eclectic Radical and PayPal Eclectic Radical are the preferred places to donate, with more information coming as things develop on that line. The Substack mailing list is still the best place to make sure you don't miss any shows. And I really appreciate everybody who's still watching, everybody who's still supporting. We can always use more people watching, more people talking about the show during the week, and more people supporting the show. But I appreciate everyone we've got. Thank you, everyone, this week. And from Seth Sturm and Chris Richards, this has been the Eclectic Radical, and we'll tweet at you. Or I will. Seth is really only on Substack these days.
That's right.